I just have to say a few words. I hate to conclude, and I have no special message to say. And I wanted to leave the floor to all the nice people that have decided to attend this seminar. So I'm just going to say a few words about what I think. Some of you have already mentioned the fact that global warming or climate change have differential effects on different populations. And I can testify that throughout the last 30 years, let's say climate change has a very differential effect on business guys and academics. Academics were not wearing ties 30 years ago, but business guys, yes. 30 years later, academics all wear tie, but business guys, no. So that's quite a change, yeah. I mean, so, but you look good. I mean, Erwan, you look good with that. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I would like just to make very small, a few points. By the way, 8. I listened carefully to what has been said throughout the last 2 days. I would like the first point. I would like absolutely you to be convinced that insurers and reinsurers are extremely sensitive to the issues of climate change. I mean, the survey you mentioned, Erwan, is not true. I live in this community. I attend incredible number of seminars, colloquium, board. It's an issue which is on the table, and we try to address the issue. So it's something which absolutely be convinced of that. It's not off the table, it's on the table. Now it's not a matter that you can easily, tackle, and therefore for you it might seem as, we're not implied enough. I don't think this is the case. I believe really that you should have no doubt that climate change is at the heart of the issues we have to face, not only today, but of course in the coming decades. By the way, we're already implied in climate change because today, we pay claims related to events that are partially due to climate change. But it's extremely difficult to disentangle when you have an event what's due to climate change and what is due to usual, business as usual, natural catastrophe. So to disentangle the source, the factor behind an event is something you have some difficulties to do it. We do too. But we pay today claims that are maybe indirectly or directly linked to climate change. So take the example of bushfire in Australia. We insure bushfires in Australia, and it seems that the frequency and the severity of bushfire in Australia is increasing, around cities and now more and more within cities. And this is something, we had the same in Canada, where we've seen a multiplication of forest fire, and certainly we don't know if it's due to climate change, but no one can exclude the hypothesis that this is directly a consequence of climate change. So, second point, we have a stake in climate change, because insurers and reinsurers, it's nice to talk about climate change, but we pay for climate change. So when we deal with it, it's not for fun or just for the sake of understanding. We are committed and we have a stake, and we are directly concerned by the consequences of climate change. Any change in the risk universe, I always say, in the risk universe, do impact the insurance and reinsurance industry. I've been listening very carefully to what you have said. The amount of uncertainty still linked to climate change is immense. So when I was listening, why don't you commit yourself for the next 30 years? I'm going to do like Erwan. Who is ready to commit in this room for the next 30 years and say, I know everything, I know what I have to do, I have a clear understanding of all the factors shaping, the risk universe? Fine, you raise your hand and ready to give you my job. Undo your tie. and do it. In other words, the amount of uncertainty about the consequence for the next 20, 30 years of climate change, as you express them to all the density functions I have seen earlier, I mean, we have the same uncertainty. We like risk. We are careful with uncertainty. I take the night distinction as always as fundamental. Insurers and reinsurers, we do know how to handle risk, which is a base for statistical distribution, probability distribution, whatever. When we face true uncertainty, we have to be careful about what we do because we have shareholders, we have stakeholders, and we need to keep a solvency, and the solvency is at stake when we take commitments we cannot afford. So, as I said, my true capital is a solvency. Because otherwise no one is going to give me the risk if they believe that I'm not able to stick to my commitment and honor my signature. So it's extremely important. We still face an incredible amount of uncertainty, and as soon as it will clear up a little bit, I'm quite sure that the supply of coverage will increase. It has been the case historically, always. And what we fear, I can tell you, what we fear is a transition period. It's not the new regime. Once the regime is in place, we cope with the regime. But when you have a transition from one regime to another one, usually it's extremely costly for the industry, just because most of the time we pay claims with no equivalent in terms of premiums. So it's these transitions that we're facing, explaining why the industry may appear shy to you, but appear extremely, let's say, adventurous sometimes for me. The third point, don't believe that the consequence of climate change on the insurance and reinsurance industry, the overall consequences are positive for us. Many people say, oh, new risk, new premium, new profit, easy statement. For them, it's fantastic. The risk universe is expanding, and therefore insurers and especially reinsurers will make additional money just because it's superb, It's one way to make additional revenue. In the transition period, I repeat, most likely it's going to be negative because we'll take risk, and the cost of risk will certainly exceed the premiums we can collect. In a second stage, it might be different, but the transition period seems to be long. And once again, according to what I've seen throughout the last 2 days and what I read before, before reaching the new regime, it will take decades. So it's a kind of catch-up mechanism where we wait for information, we wait for data, we wait for facts. But in the meantime, we have to provide coverage. In the meantime, we have to pay for the claims. That's an uncertain environment, and we're facing this one. So in the short term, it might be negative. In the long term, it might be more positive. In the short term, we will see an increase in the frequency of certain risk, floods. In the short term, we are going to see an increase in the severity of certain risks. For instance, storm surge. I mean, that's certainly what we've experienced in some part of the world. And we were talking about Sandy. I already mentioned forest fires, and I can mention other perils. And so this is, yes, global climate change will enlarge the risk universe. In the meantime, the traditional risk remain on the balance sheet. Quakes do not depend on climate change. It seems, at least it has not been proven yet, that quakes and climate change are linked. Maybe it will be one day. So for us, we have already all the risk we cover, and on top of it, we add all the risk linked to climate change. So it's an expansion of the risk universe, as I said. Nothing disappears, but new risks emerge and arise and increase in their severity. Fifth point is the fact that, yes, I agree with what has been said at the previous roundtable. The demand for insurance and reinsurance for climate change's risk will certainly increase. That's a fact. Awareness is growing. It's now on the political agenda. is something which is, market for ideas is a market like another market, lots of supply, and therefore awareness of many economic agents is increasing, and therefore we expect an increase of the demand for insurance and reinsurance from parties that wish to protect themselves against those climate change's consequences. The true question for us is not, we never applaud when we see an increase of demand, like terrorism. Why should we applaud when we see an increase for terrorist coverage? For us, we immediately go to the next question, which is it insurable? And the question of insurability of the risk associated to climate change, that's a true question we have to address. Is it insurable? Can we efficiently pool all the risks around the world? It's not that obvious, and all the discussion about global and regional risk exposure about climate change is fundamental for us. I mean, we can pool only and only if we have the right dimension, and if we can go cross-border. It's difficult to diversify. If we cannot do it, we're not going to do it. So, and all the discussions about the broad picture and the small picture is essential for us, because when we insure a party, it's for a geographic area, it's for one nation, maybe it's for one site. It's not around the globe, and so we need more understanding, so as to be sure that we can efficiently pool the risk linked or associated to climate change. Second, will the cost of protection be affordable by economic agents? We talked this morning about willingness and capacity to pay. It's nice to say that we have a risk, and at the end of the day, it's a question of money, of resources. And we see today that even so there is a demand for coverage, not everyone is ready to pay the true cost of risk, what I would say is a risk-adjusted premium, just because, as I said earlier, awareness is growing, but many agents still are reluctant to pay the true price for risk, and therefore you see an increasing demand and a limited supply. The gap is just due to the fact that the price on today's coverage might exceed the capacity of some agents or their willingness to pay, and it is underneath is below what we expect to cover what we believe is a true cost of risk. So we are in the transition period again. The demand is shaping up. The supply is still a little bit reluctant. The price doesn't reflect the true meeting of the supply and the demand. So it's a kind of trial and error process, as we have seen for terrorism after WTC, and till governments step in a few countries, there were limited supply, high demand for terrorist coverage. We are in this transition period where on both sides of the supply and demand, we have forces trying to find solutions, but not fully meeting today. So we also need certainly to see more investments to be made to limit the aggregate exposure of certain risk linked to climate change. We talked a lot about prevention. Let's say concretely, we're not yet there. And for insurance, very often we say, yes, it's insurable, but please first do and apply all the prevention mechanism, do the investments in terms of infrastructure, whatever, and we will follow up. But we are late in implementing those prevention measures, and therefore we are also a little bit reluctant to take the risk without prevention measures. That's very usual again. That's what I call the transition period. It's a little bit a catch-22. I'm ready to insure if you, but we will do only if you insure. That type of dialogue is today taking place. Sixth point I would like to make, it has been mentioned during the previous roundtable, to ensure the risk associated to climate change, we will need to implement new public-private partnership, not the type that we see in the US, because this is more and more, it's not a partnership. You have a big government and the small insurers. It's difficult to dance when you have a very tall dancer on one side, very small dancer on the other side. It's not the way you can dance, smoothly and nicely. You mentioned something very important at the end, one about optimal public-private partnership. And certainly, if there is one area of research we would like to sponsor, is how to design efficient public-private partnership. We need, for certain risks and perils, public-private partnership. For coverage, we need to cover a larger part of the population. So is it through subsidies, price? We need stop losses because certain risks are not insurable because it's a question of capacity. So government has to step in for, as it has been the case for terrorist attack, when the sum of claims exceed the capacity of the market. We need some types of stop losses, as we say in jargon, and therefore, yes, we need also government to implement risk mitigating actions. So, as far as we're concerned, we're ready to go to public-private partnership, but please help us to design those partnerships in a way where we minimize the cost for the government. It's obvious. We extend the coverage to the entire population, and at the end of the day, you have to protect the insurance companies and their solvency because it's a public good. And so here you have an arbitrage between competing demands where we need economists to give us their views and certainly their solutions. 7 points, it has been mentioned also, and I just repeat, capital markets will play a role in the future for, catastrophic coverage. We see it today. By the way, we as SCOR, we are reinsurer, but we issue ILS, we invest in ILS, and we help clients to structure ILS. ILS being those cat bonds, and we issue mortality bonds. So we know the technique, and we are very active in this market. By the way, historically, one of the first company to issue cat bonds, and we still do it. So, and we believe here too, it's a question of what's the size of capital market instruments and the relative size of reinsurance, I don't like traditional reinsurance, but let's reinsurance types of coverage. There are pros and cons for both. So it's not, there's no one technique saying, better than the other one. And here too, I think I believe this is an area of research, how to combine the capacity of the capital market on one side, the capacity of traditional insurance and reinsurance on the other side, so as to increase the capacity to absorb those big catastrophes. Everything that goes in the direction of increasing the capacity to absorb those major catastrophes is positive, it's welfare enhancing. I would start to talk like Christian Gaulier, so I have to be careful. It does increase the utility of all agents, just because people want protection, and if we can provide this protection, it will be positive, given a certain risk aversion that we can see everywhere around the world. So, yes, here too, this is an area of research, how to combine capital market instruments with traditional insurance and reinsurance. Now, cat bonds have not been tested. I always say that. It has not been tested yet. We didn't have a major catastrophe where people investing in cat bonds are ruined. That's what I call a stress test, okay? So it might happen once, I don't know, and there will be. Second, the increase of interest rates will certainly dry up a little bit the influx of capital into those instruments. And so this is in the hand of Mr. Draghi and Mrs. Yellen, but today it's the optimal situation. Ultra low interest rates on risk-free instruments, so-called risk-free, and in the meantime almost no major catastrophe. And so we have to wait a little bit how the capital market is going to adapt itself once we have a real stress test. It will come. We don't know the date. But we know that the probability of having a major event somewhere around the world, be it a quake, be it a large hurricane, this probability is 1. We don't know the date, but the probability is 1. That's my job, to face such uncertainty. That's the last point. We are also investors. Reinsurers are investors. By the way, George, you gave impressive data about the amount of investments we do and the assets that we manage. And therefore, we will certainly be called in order to finance investments to reduce the consequence of climate change, either by clean energy, we talked about green bonds, certainly finance infrastructure, because infrastructure must be adapted to the new world where we have to fight against climate change. We have also, as investor, to select investments having in mind the negative effect of certain industries on climate change. So we start to do it, you have to know, and there were recent announcements in the industry where we decided not to invest anymore, not to be shareholder anymore, not to have equity anymore for certain plants or for certain industries that we believe should not receive additional financing and even less financing than before. So this is on the asset side. So it's what I try to say, it's for my industry and for my company, the issue of climate change is going to affect all the liability sides because it changes the risk universe, it changes the exposure, it changes the aggregate exposure, it changes the technique. And we are in competition with the capital market, as I said. And on the asset side, it will also have a major impact just because we will have to redesign an asset management policy in order to take into account all the effects of climate change. Now, having said that, I always say it when I have the floor, the Solvency II capital charge are stupid, insane, out of mind. When we invest in a risk-free bond of our government, we have no capital charge. We invest in infrastructure with a huge capital charge. It's absolutely contrary to what we should do. And here, really, we need to convince policymakers that the first decision to take, and this is in the hand, is to adapt the capital charge that have been introduced in Solvency II. By the way, some of the capital charge of the rating agencies are also going in the same direction and should be changed in order to push us to invest in, I would say, long-term, relevant, sustainable investments, you can call that, because it will be good for us, good for the community at large, knowing that the question of return of those investments is still key, and hopefully those returns will be positive, because that's one way for us to ensure solvency. So I would conclude on that. Those are questions and convictions. Those are not conclusions. We support the SCOR Foundation. We support science. We support research. And all those issues could certainly be dealt with by the scientific community, and therefore don't hesitate to send research projects. And we will be glad. We have a scientific committee, and we will be glad to support research going into a better understanding of climate change and better understanding of the consequence of climate change and better understanding how we can cope with climate change and have an additional contribution to governments. So those are the few points I wanted to just tackle quickly, and I give you, Mariam, the floor with the excellent panel that you have assembled.
Thank you very much, Dennis, because this was a very nice overview and reflections on the 2 days of discussions. I have attempted to also bring some of the issues that has been discussed so that through this panel of executives and leading managers of the industry, we can maybe propose some practical solutions in terms of the directions for the future as to what the industry should do. So just very quickly, we had the pleasure of listening to 3 prominent scientists. But one thing we need to recognize is that the world of science is very coordinated. And every one of these scientists are working as part of 2 international programs that are looking at dynamics of different hazards, how these hazards change in their characteristics from year to year, from decade to decade, and then what does climate change means for that. Synthesis of all these massive scientific research goes into IPCC assessment, which supports UNFCCC negotiations. But as it was discussed, significant technologies are coming out of this weather and climate research that are translating into forecasting technologies, from weather all the way to the longer time scales, that are bringing industry practical data and information that goes into various aspects of decision support tools. So my very first point, and the question that I will be sort of confronting you with, are we harnessing science as best as we can for this industry? First question. I will step through that. The second issue that we discussed here was issue of risk modeling, statistical versus forward-looking. Is past a good representation of the future? And science is only part of that. I think what we heard in some of the discussion is population and development in the world has to be a critical factor in that forward-looking analysis. And are we putting the forces of science, engineering, development, and all of that into really see how we can better project for the future? So that would be really the second one. Now, I heard through many of the presentations here about adaptation and what does it mean, and it came in piecemeal, early warnings, prevention, and so on. So currently, over the last 10 years, there have been massive international movement that is supported by funding that's coming from the countries for international development to move into countries with economies in transition and developing countries to help governments build governance, institutional, regulatory, and financing mechanisms that they can actually implement adaptation. And the most pragmatic part of that has been disaster risk reduction. So the elements of this support that's going to the government is helping them with developing their policy, legislation, institutional frameworks, and then enabling the capacity to do risk analysis so that decisions are risk-based. And then the solutions are coming about through building early warning system and preparedness measures. I think we spoke about the vigilance system of France as one. Prevention and mitigation through sectoral planning and investments, and risk financing. And very importantly, I guess the last panel really pointed to the fact of the prominence of the role of government in moving into this zone for financing risk. So the issue that remains here is, and I think this is something that Dennis ended with, proper public-private partnerships. Where does that begin? How does that get catalyzed, and how does that comes about? But with or without this industry, there is a world out there with a lot of funding behind it that's working particularly in economies and developing nations to do this. So we can be part of that solution or not, and the train is moving. So that's my next message. So in summarizing some of the challenges that I have heard, I would say I put them in changing patterns of extreme events and climate risk, issues that economic risks are on the rise, past not a good trust for the indicator of the future. Do we actually have the data on hazard, asset, and exposure side to better understand these? And then issues pertaining to quantification of risk and understanding the correlations around the world. And particularly that's where reinsurance kicks in. Gaps in insurance demand. One of the critical issues there is, I personally worked in over 60 countries around the world, and reality is governments remain reactive, inadequate policies, legislation, and lack of investment in prevention. Everything now is moving towards preparedness. Lack of understanding of insurance, lack of incentives for the insurance sector to get engaged because of subsidies or post-disaster relief funds, regulatory hurdles, and cultural hurdles. Issues pertaining to use of science and technology to better understanding the risk. That's on this corner, I won't get into that. And finally, I think something that we need to really discuss, we cannot survive as a single sector. And this is no longer a single sector. This is an issue that's multi-sectoral. It engages governments, it engages different economic sectors, it engages scientific community, and anybody that works at the government level, you see that still decision-making across sectors are siloed. And how can insurance be a cross-cutting mechanism that can bring that together? So with that said, I would like to introduce my very prestigious panel here. And I will start by introducing Victor Peñé, who is the CEO of SCOR Global PNC with a very prominent background in marine and offshore oil and gas insurance programs. Then I have Pierre-André Chiappori, who is the Rowan and Barbara Steinschneider Professor of Economics at Columbia. I have Christian Tinman, Group Head of Strategy and Public Affairs at AXA. I have Masaki Nagamura, who is the Division Head for Corporate Social Responsibility and General Manager and Corporate Planning at Tokyo Marine. And finally, Peter Hoppe, who is the Head of Georisk Research at Munich Re. So what we are going to do is we have questions for each of the panelists. So each panelist will tackle a question for 10 minutes, and then we will stop, open to questions from the audience, and then I'm going to stop and have them come up reflectively with 2-3 topics that they think insurance industry should take on as a priority in this field in moving ahead. So the very first question, I have to put now my glasses on, is Victor Peñé, who is going to be responding, what are the critical drivers, hurdles, and incentives for generating demand and filling the protection gap related to extreme events and climate risk, now and into the future, developed and developing countries. And I turn that to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
This should be 10 minutes each.
Well, to be honest, there was a first question before, but the panelist is not there. Question was about opportunities. So I think I'll start by saying that we need to acknowledge that the opportunities are there. The opportunities are there because there has never been as much capital that is flowing in this industry that there has been for the last 3 years. And unfortunately, that capital is destructive at the moment because it is unused. It tries desperately to find ways to be used and basically is destroying principles of insurance in many lines of business. So I think we are suffering from an influx of capital at the same time as we are suffering from our non-capability to grow our business, to take those opportunities and convert them into real business and real risk-taking. So starting from the fact that the opportunities are there, but we are unable to convert them, well, the question is basically, what are the drivers, what are the problems, what are the hurdles? And, well, how can I get my slide? Click under? There? Mm-hmm. Not really. That's it. It was simple. Well, I think I've been asked to go through 3 types of markets or 3 types of economies: developing, emerging, developing, mature economies. I think the main feature is the common feature between the 3 of them, which is not on that slide, but which is the complexity and the number of stakeholders we have to deal with. We have to deal with stakeholders that can be governments at the state, federal, region, municipality, so in each country, different types of government bodies and regulators and consumers, which means number of stakeholders which is, well, very high, which is subject to conflicting interest, competing interest, and we are there ourselves trying to offer solutions and trying to find a common denominator that can satisfy all those stakeholders. And this has been a major difficulty that is common basically to emerging developing markets and mature economies and mature insurance markets. Basically, there are three conditions to develop, well, climate risk insurance. One is legal stability, fiscal stability, commitment of the government when the insurance is subsidized, that the subsidies are going to be stable, that the cash flow of the subsidies is going to be stable, that we are not having client of ours issuing policies and facing the subsidies not coming, the losses coming, negative cash flows, and problem to capture their premiums, which is the recipe for a disaster, because the original insureds then have paid the premium, their part of the premium, and they are suffering from losses not being paid by insurers that are facing negative cash flows. So I think the test in any market that we try to create, the first claim is the major test. If the first claim doesn't work, then you are going backwards several years and you restart from scratch. So basically, legal, fiscal, well, stability is essential. Actuarial and modeling comes second. Willingness to develop data to help us to collect statistics. But this can be organized, in my opinion. It takes some time, of course, but it can be organized. It can be solved if we have a landscape between the stakeholders where there is a common agreement, and that common agreement is perceived by everyone as stable over time. You will see the second slide that will illustrate this sort of problem we are having. Then, assuming this major, well, common frame is there, then I think on the mature economies and mature insurance market, there are basically a major differentiator, that is legacy. If you are in mature economies and mature markets, you have a legacy. Whether there is insurance for climate risk today or there isn't any, anyway, you've got legacy. If there is not any insurance or whatever scheme available, there may be a legacy by practice. Practice is basically how the governments, the authorities in the countries at all levels, again, municipalities, federal, regional, state, have authorized, well, the urbanization, the industrialization of the countries, have allowed construction permits, have allowed certain codes not to be upgraded over time. This is a legacy that means in those countries where there is no scheme available, well, you've got a number of residentials, of industrial facilities that are basically uninsurable. And if you want to put insurance in place, then you are facing that problem of having a legacy to overcome. How are you going to explain to those that are insurable because of that legacy that they are excluded from the scheme? And you can have legacy by law, which is as complicated as the legacy by practice. Legacy by law means that there are systems, schemes that have been put in place following, well, decrees of certain laws, going through parliaments. This has made an extremely heavy, sticky sort of system, and any change is a major, major problem. You need an agreement, well, again, coming back to political aspect, social aspects, and then very few countries, actually no one probably in the world at the moment, can create the consensus. Even after an event, that consensus doesn't exist. And we have proof of that going through the major event of the last 10 years. You can see that even an event is not sufficient to create a consensus in the country that is victim of the event. So if you talk about the neighbor country, just forget it, they just don't care. Well, if you look at the picture I was describing, and this question of legacy, formal, non-formal legacy, it means that, well, in order to move from legacy to a risk-reflected reinsurance framework, it's a bit like, well, the need is for a major structural change reform. And there, I think insurance and risk are very comparable to tax and debt. And the same problem that we have in each country all over the world, or in each economic region, like the EU, for instance, is, well, basically the major hurdles to go on with reforms of the tax systems. I think in the same way as we are having those problems to reform the tax systems, and we are having problem with the debt accumulation, we have a problem with climate risk and how we can develop climate risk insurance. What is the parallel? The parallel is basically pooling risk in front of premium payers and financiers of those risks. being insurance, reinsurers, and capital market. At the same token, as in front of issuing of debt for a country, you bring a pool of taxpayers and the capability of that country to pay the taxes that are going to be able to sustain the service of the debt. I think it's no different, which means that basically, well, in any given country, assuming that there is no cross-country mutualization, the question is, are we creating an insurance system that is having sustainability over time, which is, in a way, payback capabilities for the losses that the financiers are going to finance? So you go from, well, the right to the left at the bottom of the slide. First question for creating a system is affordability. Well, it's nice to try to sell insurance, but how are the original insured capable, how much are they capable to pay insurance premium in a sufficient way to create that pool of premium that is commensurate to the pool of risk? Then it is a bit useless, in a way, to create cover that are too extensive, that are creating an exposure to risk that goes beyond the capability of that pool of premium payers to pay back losses. And mutualization across countries is like a dream. It doesn't exist. In today's time, it is impossible for insurers to sell premium increase in the neighborhood country, even though that neighborhood country may be subject to the same sort of peril exposure as the country that was just hit. The second is obligation to buy versus obligation to offer. An obligation to offer doesn't work. It doesn't provide the mutualization. It is just the recipe for anti-selection. So you have to create an obligation to buy. Again, affordability plus obligation to buy. How can you put that into play? And then the third one, basically, is, well, how can you accompany by, as Denis was saying, the creation of an insurance market by the proper investment in loss control and defenses that bring the risk into an insurability status, whereby we can ourselves prospectively believe that we are entering into a viable business. Which is why I believe that whether you have formal legacy or non-formal legacy, it is going to be impossible to reform overnight totally the system. And a good example of that, and I would conclude with this, is what is happening today in the UK with Flood Re. Well, I wish good luck to that system. I think at least it's a first step, but it's also a transitional system, whereby, well, there is a kind of a commitment, whether this commitment will, well, really stay over time, on the length of time that this commitment is required to make that system to work remains to be seen, but at least, well, there is a kind of an agreement today whereby, well, the UK as a country should be embarking into something like 20 to 25 years of conversion of an existing non-insurance system to a risk-reflective insurance system, starting with basically what is required, which is subsidizing the risks that are either uninsurable or which the owners of are unable to afford the premium volume. So I believe that this could be an example, if ever it works, this could be an example of what could be a solution to enter into a transition form of reform that has got a chance of succeeding, and then could be like a pioneering for, well, more example of that sort in other areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can invite Pierre-André, he will be talking about what are desired national and international financing policies, regulatory and institutional factors to harness more effectively insurance reinsurance for managing risk of extreme events. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a huge question, so I'll concentrate my comments on one specific aspect, which is Denis' point number 7, if I counted well, which is the relationship with the financial markets. Although, of course, this will have an impact on regulation, and I'm going to try to tackle both aspects very briefly, so I have 10 minutes. So there are 3 things that I would like to do during those 10 minutes. First of all, I would like to show you a graph. This dates back to when I was a student a few years ago. At that time, we were taught that there were cycles in reinsurance. And the story was pretty simple. You start with a situation here in which you have overcapacity, so prices. This green line here is a price index in the reinsurance industry. You start from a situation in which you have overcapacity, prices are very low. And then you got an event, and what the event is doing is wiping out a significant fraction of the capital. Capital is reduced, capacity is reduced, supply is reduced, prices shoot up, big time in that case, the factor is almost 4. So you're in a situation in now the business has a very fat margin, is very profitable. Out of this profit, they reconstitute the capital, and supply essentially goes back to where it was, and of course, the price goes down accordingly. Now, one thing that's extremely striking with this is an obvious example of inefficient allocation of capital. If you're at this moment up there, this is a moment in which capital is extremely productive in this particular industry, which simply means that the industry is lacking capacity. The industry is craving for more capacity, and the economic response should be to allocate a lot of capital to this industry. And it does happen, but it takes time. It takes those 4 or 5 years. That's very inefficient. Well, that's the first part of the graph. And by the way, I stole this graph from my colleague and friend, John Lam-Tennant from Wharton and Guy Carp. Now, if you look at this, Andrew was big, but there are things which are much bigger here. You got Katrina, you got the World Trade Center, and those cycles essentially have been reduced. They basically disappeared. That's efficient allocation of capital, and we see it. Those boxes here are the entering of new capital on the market, and there are various ways of doing this. There are startups, there are sidecars, there are cat bond, and which are the light blue, which are catching up, and so on. So essentially, what we see more and more is the right response, which is there is some kind of demand for new capital because capacity has been reduced, capital enters, and then that the normal functioning of a market economy, the return on capital is high in this sector at this particular moment, capital should fly in. Now, I'm not saying that this inflow of capital is without risk, and on this I will agree with Victor, that we should be careful about this. Now, my second thing, so the first thing was this diagram. Second thing, a few numbers, and they will be close to numbers that have been given in the previous presentations. This, as I said, this here is the worst disaster in terms of cost for the insurance and reinsurance industry. That Katrina cost, the order of magnitude 50 billions. If you compare it to the total capital of reinsurance company, it's not huge, but it's not negligible. It's really far from negligible. Let's take a different benchmark. Let's look, for instance, at the total capitalization of the New York Stock Exchange. Well, it's something like 15 trillion. Let's take, as Erwan and George were saying, let's take the total asset under management in insurance companies. We're talking 25, 30 billions. Pension fund, it would be more. Just the daily trade on the Forex, which is the market for foreign exchanges, the daily trades are 5 trillions. What this means is that when the index of the New York Stock Exchange fluctuates by 1%, and this is not an exceptional event, the amount of wealth which is distracted or created is 3 times the worst catastrophe in the history of the reinsurance industry. What this means is that when we're talking about capacity, we should be very careful, because the potential capacity, if you measure it by financial market standard, is infinite. The kind of capacity that's needed for the reinsurance industry, at least for now, is trivial vis-à-vis the potential supply. And if we could tap into this potential supply, there will be no capacity problem. Of course, the real difficulty is how can we do that? How can we do that in practice? And what we see here are various ways of doing that. So the cat bond, as everybody has been talking about cat bond is something very natural. It's an asset that you directly sell on financial market. Of course, it comes with limitations. You cannot cover the basis risk. You have to define it very carefully and so on. What we see is other innovation. In particular, what we see is a system in which big financial institution, pension fund, someone with a lot of capacity teams up with a hedge fund, And you got a kind of intuition is the hedge fund will bring the technical expertise, the financial institution will bring the capacity, and those people enter the market. And now, the last thing I would like to do is think about those situations from an economic viewpoint. And of course, the economic viewpoint will have regulatory implications. So from an economic viewpoint, there are two ways we can think about this. One way would be the standard insurance viewpoint, which is the viewpoint that will be adopted by the regulator of insurance company. And this is very simple. You're trying to cover a risk. You should put capital, and the capital should be proportional to the size of the risk. Now, you can measure the size of the risk by the VaR, by the tail VaR whatsoever, but really the capital should respond, in a sense, to the size of this risk. That's, standard for insurance logic. Okay, now, let's switch to a financial logic. First of all, this kind of investment is a tiny part of the portfolio. And of course, regulation is not about each risk, it's about the portfolio. Now, Finance 101, what we teach to our students, the CAPM. CAPM tells you what you're rewarded, the kind of risk that you're rewarded for bearing, rewarding being receiving an excess return beyond the riskless return. It's not the risk. It's the part of the risk which is correlated with the market. It's the beta. So from a financial point of view, you're not asking yourself what the size of the risk, you're asking yourself what the size multiplied by the beta, and the beta is close to zero. So from a financial viewpoint, the cost of bearing this additional risk is very low. So here we have this contradiction between the insurance logic, which tells you the cost is proportional to the risk, and the financial logic, which tells you, no, but the beta is very small. That's something that should be taken into account. Now, what I'm saying here is two things. The first thing, and I will conclude on this, the first thing is it might be the case that big financial institutions have a comparative advantage in terms, not only because they have this huge capacity, but also because they are in a situation in which they can exploit this low beta in a way that insurance companies cannot. And this is a regulatory problem, obviously, because the reason why insurance company cannot is because the regulator will not let them do that, whereas the financial institution, the regulator will let them do that. But there is an economic background, there is an economic foundation to this difference. And my second point is that at the end of the day, what I see there are reasons for optimism. In the, quote, traditional model of reinsurance, and I'm like Denis, I don't like the word traditional, but the traditional vision of reinsurance which was prevalent here, right, in those periods, reinsurance companies were doing two things. They were bringing expertise and they were bringing capacity, and those two things were coming together. Now, if you think of it, that's inefficient for the following reason. Expertise is essentially a fixed cost business. You need to invest a lot in knowledge, in science, and so on, to be able just to price a natural catastrophe. And that's something that everybody here has said and something that we know. But once you've paid this price, whether you're covering 10 millions or 10 billions, the price is the same. Essentially, the price of knowledge does not depend on the amount you're covering. Now, what's sort of inefficient is a situation in which you're making those huge investments, but then you cannot exploit them on a full scale just because you're limited by capacity. What I see in the future is more and more a divorce between the expertise and the capacity, and that's good news because it means that companies, in particular reinsurance companies, insurance and reinsurance companies, would have been investing a lot in those expertise. They, in principle, should be able to apply this expertise on a much larger scale because they could relax a little bit the capacity constraint. This doesn't go without problem, of course, and there are many problems that have been mentioned, and I think we're going to discuss this. But at the end of the day, I think from an economic point of view, it's good news. Thank you very much.
We now continue with Christian Thiemann, and he will be talking about what would need to change in the regulatory and policy framework to orient the financial system more towards long-term issues, including climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to SCOR and the SCOR Foundation for the invitation. It's a great moment to reflect about regulation because sort of the cycle after the crisis has come to a close, almost. So we have seen over 30 major regulatory initiatives in Europe, We have seen, of course, the major Dodd-Frank and everything that's related to that initiative in the United States. So there has been regulation on banks, on insurers, on asset managers, on hedge funds, on other institutions, regulations on markets, regulations on consumers, regulations on compensation, regulation on all other things. The question is, if we take all of this together, what do we get? What's the picture? And I think, first of all, one should make a compliment to the regulators, not just that they have worked very, very hard and that they have put together things that are really, really rigorous and really, really complex, but also because they have made major achievements. And I would say that we can single out 3 major achievements. First, the sectors individually are financially more stable. The banking sector in particular is better capitalized, is more stringent, and is a greater source of stability. And the same is probably true for insurance in the sense that Solvency II is certainly a better framework than Solvency I, and that's also true for other institutions. The second point I think one can make is that supervision has been much improved. New institutions have been created, the central banks won all over the world, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and of course also the ECB. New institutions have been created, they're called in Europe EBA, they're called ESMA, they're called EIOPA, the systemic risk boards have been established, and the new philosophy of macroprudential supervision has been invented, and people are very excited about that. And the third achievement I believe one can make is that markets are more transparent because products are simpler overall, and derivatives in particular are more cleared through central counterparties rather than over the counter. So stronger sectors, stronger supervision, and more transparency of markets are 3 very important achievements, and I believe that regulators deserve recognition for that. There is still the feeling, though, that not all issues are solved. There's still the feeling that this has been very effective at avoiding the mistakes of the past, but there's still the feeling that this does not yet sufficiently prepare us for the future. And there's the feeling that the stability is there, but somehow it's fragile. There's the feeling that the control is very complex. There's the feeling that there's still a lot of short-termism in the sector. There's the feeling that somehow the financial sector, especially in mature countries, does not really serve the bigger environmental, economic, and societal needs. And that is a feeling which gets very clear if we talk about climate, and climate change in particular. If you just think for a moment, climate is by definition a very, very long-term issue. It is an issue whose outcomes are very uncertain. It's an issue that deserves major investments, and investments not just in financial assets, but in hard technology, in infrastructure, that involves change in energy production, in energy utilization, and so on and so forth. It's an issue which cannot be dealt by the financial industry alone. It's very much a real sector issue. It is also an issue that cannot done by the public sector alone. It is very much a private sector issue. So climate is an issue also where the risks are not just financial, they're very broad. They're environmental, they're ecological, they are societal, they're perhaps economic. It's a very, very broad notion. So if you compare the needs that are very clear on the climate issue, that are long-term, that are in the private sector, on driven hard technology, on infrastructure, that involve a lot of partnerships and that go much beyond financial, with what the regulation looks at, you will see that there's a big disconnect because the regulation is very much focused on the financial risks. It's really avoiding another financial crisis, another bailout. And that's a legitimate task, but it's not the only task. So that is what regulation is. It is very much finance for the sake of finance. It is rather short-term oriented. And if you look at the regulatory implications more closely, you will see that it's very heavily oriented towards public sector instruments. You can imagine the financial sector if you imagine a soccer field, so to say, in concentric circles in the soccer field. And if you think in the center are government bonds, and the center of the center are US treasuries and German bonds. And around that center, you have French government bonds, Italian government bonds, which are traded as a markup on the guys in the very center. So you have almost in concentric circles the government bonds, then you have the corporate bonds that are priced as a markup on the government bonds, then you have stocks which are priced as a markup on the corporate bonds, and then you have all the other things, infrastructure, alternative assets, very much far out the corner. If you monitor where the financial institutions sit, you will find they're all crowded in the center. It's very, very crowded, that space. And that's why prices are high. Everybody craves for government assets. and everybody craves for them because regulators ask for that. If you ask a bank, how do they cover the liquidity coverage ratio, the prime tool is by government bonds. If you look at our own sector regulation insurance, and Duni alluded to that, the capital charges in government bonds are zero. Be they from Germany, France, or Greece, they are zero. In equities, the capital charge on the Solvency II is 39%. So you see that the further out you go, the more expensive life becomes. So we see a situation where everybody is crowding in the center. And now another big guy arrived called ECB and also dropped right in the center and said, I also work here and I act here and I buy 60 billion euro of assets every year. So you can see that there's a big issue of everybody really focusing very much on government debt in particular and on debt more broadly otherwise. And that, of course, creates an issue because the space in the corners is very, very thin. Insurers would love to invest more in infrastructure. On average, they have only 1% invested, but it's very complicated. You need special expertise, the capital charges are very high, and of course, the sector is assessed on a one-year horizon, right? The Solvency II is on a one-year test. Even your liabilities are 7.5 years on average, and up to 30, 40 years, it is a one-year horizon. So climate is a very interesting issue where we see how much this is stretched and where we see the tension between the short-term needs to stabilize the financial system and the longer-term needs to finance the real economy in particular, and also to finance the preparation for climate change and nat cat preparation and so on. And that is, I would say, the current moment where we are, and this is why reflection on sort of adjusting the regulation without pouring the baby with the bathing water would be absolutely essential. And certainly sort of looking at what is needed for the longer term investments on infrastructure investments, on capital charges on those, on creating an own infrastructure asset class, on possibly reducing the capital charge on equity, because if you look forward, this is the asset you would like to be in. This is the asset you are financing the real economy, you're financing the private sector that can provide positive externalities. So this is really the stretch, I think, where we are at the moment. And to the question, who can take action, it is also a complex one because sort of the issue has been so much compartmentalized that every regulator looks at his or her own narrow set. So we cannot ask the insurance regulator in a country to deviate. We can probably not ask the regulator in a country overall to deviate. It has to be sort of a global impetus that has to come, and maybe the G7 is one, and hopefully the G20 is another one, that sort of gives this change and that says, yes, we have made major achievements, we want to preserve them, but we cannot overlook the longer-term needs in our economy, in our society, and for the environment. And that would be possible probably just with a readjustment. So one doesn't have to scrap what one has done, but one has to be mindful there are other issues and other motives in the global economy that one needs to cater for, and I believe the financial institution would be absolutely ready for all the reasons that we mentioned to do so, and what is just needed is now a political impetus not to look to the past only, but also to look at the future. Thank you.
We now have Masaki Nagamura, who is going to talk about how can the knowledge, experience, and expertise of insurance sector be best harnessed to support development of sound strategies for managing risk of climate? Thank you. Yes, of course.
Okay, yes, I'm more comfortable here. Miriam, thank you so much for the introduction. And before I start, I'd like to thank Professor Kessler and friends at SCOR for inviting me here and your hospitality. It's been great 2 days. I'd like to talk from my experience what insurance companies can do further to help society become more resilient. I think as an insurance company, we can interact with the society with or without our main product, which is insurance. And perhaps I'd like to start from using the non-insurance approach. My home country, Tokyo Marine, is based in Japan, which sits in the Pacific Rim ring of fire and is under constant threat of natural disasters. We have earthquake, typhoon, but these days we are also seeing some unusual situations such as unusually heavy snowstorms, landslides, or even volcanic eruption, although this is not climate related. So if any of you who haven't visited Japan, I'd be happy to book a trip for you. It's so exciting. But in such country, the March 11, 2011 experience of earthquake and tsunami really changed the paradigm. We tend to think from our past experience, and most of the local guidelines to enhance disaster preparedness is based on past experience. If you think about hazard maps, those are mostly based on past experience. But what happened in March 11, 2011 was that event went way beyond past experience. So that pushed us to think more towards taking a probabilistic approach versus a deterministic approach. Even though no such thing happened in the history, by the scientific input, you can you can picture what may happen in the very worst case. In our case, Tokyo Marine has partnered with Tohoku University, which is a knowledge tank that sits in the middle of the hardest hit Tohoku region. They too felt that they were not strong enough to withstand the March 11 event. So we started focusing on probabilistic approach and created a hazard map which which extended beyond the past experience. And those information not only helps us provide professional advice to our customers, but we also use those information to help educate the school children or advise local communities to come up with an enhanced evacuation method. Now, this is an example of a tsunami, but we've been also working with several leading universities in Japan to figure out what will happen in the future climate situation. Not in the next couple of years, but 50 years ahead, 100 years ahead. How this global warming will change the genesis pattern of typhoon. Now, it turns out that most of the typhoons that hit Japan are generated in the Southern Sea, just east of where the Philippines is located. But as we have run the model, it turned out that the genesis point will move eastward. And with the with the ocean warming, the warmed temperature, the ocean surface is not cool enough to kill the intensity of typhoon. So in short, typically typhoons hit the southern part of Japan, but if it is to move further east and without losing intensity, Tokyo, the most populous city, which houses a third of the Japanese population, will will be hit more frequently in the future. So that's an alarming message to our future generation. We think that we are already using this information to review our underwriting record. But we have started to engage with the Japan Meteorological Office to think about how we can work together to best to implement disaster preparedness program on either a national basis or subnational basis. So that's something we have been doing outside of the insurance production. On the insurance program, we sense that there's an increasing interest in promoting disaster risk financing mechanism in the Southeastern Asia, or those countries where, which are prone to natural disasters. For instance, APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, is now raising the issue of disaster risk financing. You may think that APEC is a trade body, and that's true. They started as a community to enhance free trade among the member economies. But what is unique with APEC is that they have the so-called finance ministers process, where finance ministers gather every once a year to discuss about the calling issues that are common in the region. And this year, and they take turns in hosting this the discussion. And this year it is the Philippine year. Next year it will be Peru, and the year following will be Vietnam. But as you can imagine, the Philippines is prone to heavy earthquake as well as windstorm, such as Haiyan. They have brought up the issue of the disaster risk financing, and they have started to encourage its peer economies to take this issue more seriously, while starting to implement their own program. Now, I think the discussion is that they're trying to introduce a sub-national program, which is being proposed by the World Bank. So the interest is there, and I think there's a lot of expectation towards the insurance industry to provide them with the proper designing of the program, and also to harness the multiple interest parties to assist the finance ministry officials. The difficulty is that even though the finance ministry officials are keen to design a program that is appropriate for the nation, it can be done just by the finance ministry. You have to have scientific knowledge and actuarial knowledge as well. And insurance industry is best positioned to offer such expertise. So I think the opportunity is there to help insurance industry get more involved and be effective in designing such program. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you. And certainly a comment to that is that these kind of initiatives are expanding beyond Asia to other regions as well, so something to look for. And then our last panelist, but certainly not least, is Peter Hoppe from Munich Re, who will talk about how could the insurance industry benefit from fostering stronger strategic partnerships in this area, and what form and shape would they take, with whom? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Mariam. I would like to start with my statement by elaborating a little bit on a specific characteristic of climate risk. And this is different from all other risks we are covering in the insurance industry. And this is the asymmetry. It has been addressed already yesterday in the morning, the asymmetry between the ones who cause the problem and the ones who are suffering most from the problem. And as a consequence of this, we need to have different approaches to solve this asymmetry and to solve the problem. In the first place, it's the industrialized countries which have a history on emitting large amounts of greenhouse gases and who have caused the current warming of the 0.85 degrees Celsius on a global scale. The number of weather-related loss events has increased. You see this clearly from our data. And interestingly, Dennis Kessler has addressed this. We don't see such a trend for the earthquakes, tsunamis, volcano eruptions, for the geophysical events. And state of the art also is that for the time being, there is still no influence of global warming on these hazards. So this is exactly the pattern we would expect if we would blame climate change as one, at least, of the drivers of that. On the long term, however, climate change can have an influence on earthquake risk because of ice melting in Greenland, for example, lifting the weight from this island. Iceland will emerge, and this will generate tensions in the Earth's crust and definitely will generate earthquakes. But this will take hopefully a couple of hundred years from now. So we don't have to be scared about this. Let's go back to the increasing weather events. We see them both in the industrialized world, but also in the world of the developing countries. I'm not really scared that we in the industrialized world, which means here in Europe, in North America, we can manage this problem. We have enough capacity to adapt, to invest into adaptation. We have insurance available. Certainly the premiums have to be adjusted if the hazard is changing, is rising, but I think at least for the first half of the century, the insurance premiums will stay affordable and the risks will stay calculable. So these are the basics that we can still be in the business. How it looks in the second half, this depends on the pathway of the future emissions. But what is the situation in the developing countries? They are living in climate zones which already today give them a hard time to make a living, to produce their food by agriculture. And if there's only a small change, then this will mean that they cannot live there anymore. They have to migrate. They don't have the capacity, the money to invest into irrigation systems or to increase flood protection, and they have a real problem. So how can we, as the insurance industry, help? And I think insurance industry definitely can support, because we can support these countries after an extreme weather event by providing quick money, which helps the economy to come back to regular business. And actually there have been 3 big studies, scientific studies, being published during the years 2011, 12, and 13, which have analyzed the economic situation, the macroeconomic situation in countries with different levels of insurance penetration. And they even have adjusted for the wealth of the countries. And all of these 3 studies, the first one has been a World Bank study, the others from scientific institutes, have found that the larger the insurance penetration is, the better the performance of the GDP, of the economy after a large event has been. In the poor countries, where there's hardly any insurance, in the developing countries, there's less than 1% of the natural disaster losses insured. People are falling into a poverty trap and hardly get out back there again, in the industrialized countries, a large event like Katrina even can contribute to a growth in GDP because the money is available, the money coming from the private sector, insurance, and this can be invested into the economy, and this drives the economy. So it's important to have insurance to help also to become more resilient in the developing countries. And this is an idea which is not new. 10 years ago, we have founded the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, which now had its 10th anniversary. And now, actually, just the day before yesterday, we've seen really a breakthrough of this idea. I don't know whether you have seen that in the media. The media have covered other topics much more than this one, but the Climate Risk Insurance Initiative is certainly the most important decision of the G7 summit in Elmau in Germany during the last days, and which will have far-reaching effects on our industry, I think, and provide a lot of chances to now develop business in regions where we have not been active yet. And this with the support of money from the G7 countries, with funding which will reach a level of 1 billion euro. This is my estimate. There's one concrete figure on the table, which is from a German Ministry of Economic Corporations. The minister has put 150 million euros on the table for the first 2 years of this 5-year project, and the others are going to follow. And so it's easy to calculate that this will reach a range of 1 billion euros. So this is the largest insurance promotion project the world has ever seen. So what has happened in Elmau? Let's get it through the most important decisions related to climate change. The first decision and agreement has been a reconfirmation on limiting global warming to 2 degrees. This is nothing new because the G8 with Russia at that time in 2009 have said the same thing. But what they now added is that as a consequence, the carbon dioxide emissions have to be reduced by 70% until 2050, and by the end of the century there has to be a total decarbonization of the industries. The second agreement has been on a reconfirmation of the target to put on an annual basis $100 billion in the so-called Green Climate Fund. And this is also nothing new. 2010 in Cancun, all the UNFCCC countries, 194 countries, have agreed already on this target. But the new thing is that now it's just 5 years to go to 2020. And the ones who have set this now may be still in responsibility and in the government. So they have to organize that. And this is the difference from the decision in 2010, where most of them perhaps hoped, I don't have to realize that. So this is a new quality of that. So, and the other commitment has been to invest more into renewable energies in Africa and other developing countries, which will also help to fight global warming, but also to provide clean energy to these countries. No concrete figure of the investments, unfortunately, has been mentioned there. And now, the last decision, which I think is a real sensational decision, because it's totally new. It has not been discussed at the climate negotiations to this level, and this is the decision for this 5-year project on climate risk insurance. The target is to insure additionally 400 million people in developing countries against losses and damages from weather-related disasters. 300 million of these 400 million by indirect insurance, which means sovereign insurance, so the government is the insured party, but then having money available to repair infrastructure, or in the case, and a good example is the African risk capacity, where there is a drought insurance, where countries in need after a big drought can buy food for the population. And actually, this has happened already. The first payouts of the African risk capacity have been made to Niger, Mauritania, and Senegal. And so they use the money to buy food and new seeds, which they can distribute then to the farmers. 300 million indirect means that if you insure a government, then the whole population are the insured, so you can get these large numbers easily. The much harder task is the rest, the 100 million, which should get direct insurance, which would be parametric microinsurance system benefiting directly to the individual. So the individual gets a payout after an extreme weather event and then can repair his or her house and or buy plants and seeds and things what they need. So this is a real new era now, I think, of public-private partnership in the framework of climate change adaptation. And I think we as the insurance industry, we should give the signal. Actually, we did it before. We had been involved in the preparation of this decision by the German government. But now I think we in the insurance industry in each of the G7 countries should give the signal to our governments that we will support that with our expertise and that we think that this is a good thing and a good system. On the other hand, these decisions certainly have sent out a real positive signal now to the climate negotiations in Paris, because they are closing now a little the gap between the demands of the developing countries and what the industrial countries want to give. It has been it's reaching the hand now from the side of the industrialized countries to the developing countries, and perhaps this creates a better mood and better precondition to get to a positive result. So I'm quite confident that Paris will go into the history books as the decisive COP changing the world to the better. I definitely hope so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have limited time. What I wanted to do is, if you could be patient, we want to entertain maybe a few questions. I will collect about 5 questions, and then we will have the panels to respond, and then they're not going to get away with it. Each one of them has to give a 30-second recap of what priorities, very short, they think the industry should do to address some of these challenges. So, any questions? Yes, please. Can you, please, the gentleman? So if you can take notes and then you respond accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. Philip Thomas, I write for German Insurance Magazine. Victor Penier mentioned the word legacy issues. What he meant was something in the context of property risks, i.e. risks which are prejudiced by their being substandard. However, if you move a bit further from the word legacy, by way of alliteration, you wind up with liability. And very strangely, the word liability was not mentioned at all during these 2 days. So I just wonder what the panel thinks about the chances of prior tortfeasors under some potentially new legal doctrine being made liable, how this would affect policies written either on a losses occurring or on a claims-made basis, what sort of exclusion clauses might be required, and on the other hand, there could also be the aspect of present-day property insurers themselves, via subrogation, going against prior tortfeasors who were responsible for particular environmental phenomena. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please, here, the lady here.
Thank you for this interesting panel. I am Ghislaine Ketani. I am a researcher. I had a question about the future of the insurance, the risk and catastrophe insurance industry. Do you think we will go toward a general model of insurance or a specialization according to some hazards?
Thank you.
Thank you.
2 questions.
The gentleman here.
Yes, the 2 gentlemen in front row. And then you will be the last one, and we will...
I don't know if you have the right to ask a question, but I have a question to Pierre-André. In your graph, which is reflecting what we have seen throughout the last 30 years, the problem, a reinsurer does 2 things. First, he pools risk in space, a big quake in Japan, no quake in the US, and so on. But also, traditionally, we're putting risk across time, across periods. We have one bad year, 10 good years, and we do our best to accumulate reserves in order to pay for the large loss, because it's really stochastic. The problem with cat bonds and newcomers is that we don't do that anymore. Because the day you have a large event, it's very clear on your graph, like Katrina, Rita, Vilma, you have newcomers, they didn't bear the losses, and they are just there, and they get the high rates, provide additional capacity, and weaken the rest of the sector. So it's a change, it's a radical change throughout the last 30 years of the way we do. Yes, we pull through space, but we are not able anymore to pull really risk through time. I believe climate change pushes to pull the risk through time. And I'm not quite sure we're able to do that. And so the long-term questions that we've been dealing with for the last 2 years, please allow us to pile up reserves and be sure that we can afford the big consequence of climate change, not by the annual premium, but through a series of premiums accumulated over time to face maybe a major change in the claims frequency or the claims severity. So that's an important question to me.
No, that's a great point. My question, is it working? Yeah. My questions for all the panelists on that capital charge issue, something we talked together a few weeks ago. Christian, AXA, has any of you been in discussion with the regulators talking about that capital charge outside of the financial discussion and actually bringing that point about the climate aspect of it, saying, well, actually, if you guys are interested in climate adaptation on a large scale and using the Paris event as an excuse to have that discussion here or in Basel and other places, saying, well, actually one of the benefits of reconsidering your capital charge on long-term investment will be our capacity to invest in long-term resiliency measures. I mean, is that something that's being discussed, or the entire discussion is being about them being crazy and them being you are crazy and everybody's saying that the other one is crazy and everybody is right? As a climate adaptation side, or mitigation for that matter, the mass investment that could be put into the mitigation side of the equation as well.
Thank you. And the last question up there, and we just turn to the panelists. I think you have a question. Can you raise your hand? Yeah, he's up. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm a PhD student at École Polytechnique, Arnaud Gousbaille. My question is also related to the graph showed by Pierre-André Capori. So you showed that insurance cycles are lower than before, and which is good from a welfare point of view. But after you showed us that cat bonds increased in the last years, so maybe it's related. However, I think that cat bonds haven't penetrated a lot in the market, and I think Erwan Michel Kerjan told us that the government increased their implication in the last 20 years. So don't you think that this improvement in the decrease of insurance cycle isn't it due to a higher implication of governments instead of a better or more efficient financial market? Thanks.
So maybe we start with you, and if you have any comments, we go.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to respond to Erwan Michel Kerjan's question on the regulation. Yes, there is a dialogue, and the dialogue goes as follows. The points are made, and then the regulators say, you know what, but we don't have enough data. We calibrate on past data. Past data, we don't have much data on infrastructure. It's true that the default rates are lower and that the loss given default is lower because the recovery rates are high on infrastructure. So the plea of the industry is to decouple that from corporate bonds and to say, let's acknowledge the high recovery rate. And at the moment, they're still stuck in saying, we don't have enough data. And that is really, I think, symptomatic of a a legitimate point of view, but of a backward-looking point of view. So it's almost that we are all stuck in a lose-lose equilibrium. Because in a way, the regulator is always right? If the capital charge is high, nobody invests, and if nobody invests, the problem isn't solved, and so on, and they were right exposed. So in a way, they would have to do a leap of faith and say, well, we want everybody to be in the good equilibrium. That means we foster this investment, people will go, there will be more investment, and the situation will turn around. So at the moment, this is really stuck on data. To the general point, I'd just like to make one remark. I believe what the industry should do is, one, upgrade technical skills in terms of data, modeling, parametric, and lowering costs. And I believe that this is underway. I see that in many parts of the industry. And the second is really engage in public-private partnerships, which is also, I mean, African risk capacity is a very, very important example. So that is the main issue. And on the broader one, on climate change, the big picture, we really have to look at assets and liabilities and see what we can do now. So on the asset side, on the investment, the margins are low, but one can do something. And the liabilities side to say, what can we offer in terms of insurance offer for products, what can we offer in terms of green bonds for our clients, and so on. So I think there, the industry, because we are so deeply exposed to climate risk, has a certain responsibility to move ahead and really think systematically how assets and liabilities are affected and what one can do.
Order of priority. On the action that we could have, I think lobbying in the good sense of it, what we have been doing for the last months or so in India to try to get a regulation that allows us to operate in a viable condition. We need to spread that and do it more intelligently, more intensively, and hopefully with success. So that's the action. The liability, I think, yeah, I mean, climate change is not just a property line of business issue. It covers as well agriculture to a very big way. I don't know if you talked about it, but for me, I mean, food supply is essential to stability of countries. So I think agriculture, insurance has got to grow and is very, very subject to climate change. Liability, I mean, what your question, of course, it's an invitation to another big pond for lawyers to make tons of money. I think that I believe myself, by experience, this will happen at a certain point, well, in time. Whether it's going to be successful or not, well, you need to know about the potential damaging you are causing to be liable. I think that's quite a principle. But, I mean, I think that, yeah, I would agree with you that we will be exposed to that at a certain point. That is an emerging risk that we are considering, and we have been doing some very prospective studies about that. The market cycle, I remember when the Piper Alpha platform exploded in the North Sea. I was in charge of the offshore at SCOR, and during that evening, didn't sleep very well, I think, and came in very early in the morning to look at my PML calculation, looked at it, was absolutely horrified, because that was a PML, you know, that was total destruction. And so the management of SCOR, I mean, of course, I was invited to go to the 14th. I mean, now this is the 6th, but at that time that was the 14th. So I arrived there and we were looking at it. And well, then we were not as well organized at that time as we are now, so we did not have a very organized communication. And I was invited to meet with journalists on my own. And so I met with journalists. And that was the question, do you think this is a market change event? And I'm an engineer by background, so I tend to be too rational. And I said, you know, I mean, I don't know, but as far as SCOR is concerned, I don't expect that to be a change, because this sort of risk has always been considered by the company at all levels. We know what we are doing. We know what we are talking about. We knew it could happen. Well, it has happened. Of course, I mean, we will have to revise our premium, but it should not change the policy. And then I was really almost fired because, of course, I mean, everyone considered that this statement was wrong. I think this statement is more and more right as risk management develops. I think the market-changing event are bad surprises, enormous bad surprises. So in the history, Andrew was an enormous bad surprise. No one had imagined that the hurricane could be that destructive. From that standpoint, I mean, we developed technologies, we developed our knowledge. Now the hurricane happens, well, cross fingers, most of the industries is prepared to that. So the reaction can be the same. World Trade Center was the first event where we realized that all our lines of business could be trapped into one event, again, big reaction. So I think what we have to imagine, or to try to imagine, we rely on our risk management people to do that, is to invent what is the scenario of an enormous bad surprise today to this industry in its stage of risk management development. I think that, and that to me explains why, because we didn't get that big surprise, independently from the factor that you highlighted, which is totally true, I mean, the fluidity of capital. But on top of that, there is the preparedness of the industry to react to that. Well, I think that's...
So I will answer to Denis and also to the gentleman here, because those questions are related. So first of all, I 100% agree on the fact that diversification is not only cross-sectional, but also throughout time, that there is absolutely no doubt about this. But I think financial markets do that as well. So in other words, yeah, if the risk, instead of being borne by a reinsurance company, is borne as part of the portfolio of a big investor, well, this big investor, maybe that year will suffer a small loss, and next year it will do better. And you know, my point here is we want to achieve diversification throughout time, but I would disagree with the fact that reinsurance companies are the only one able to do that. Financial market do that every day, in a sense, you know, and they do that on a much bigger scale. I mean, if you look at the size of the financial crisis, we survived, and that was 1,000 times bigger than any event that can affect the reinsurance industry. Actually, if you think of my graph, what my conclusion, let me try to be provocative here. My conclusion would be back in the 90s, the reinsurance industry was not very good at diversifying throughout time, because the cost for society as a whole of an event like Andrew was 4 or 5 years of under provision of insurance, and insurance was needed a lot that we could say, but there was not, the supply was not there. In a sense, I'm not talking about the behavior of reinsurance company, I'm just talking from the economic point of view. We had the problem that the cost of this event was felt in the economy for several years. We don't have this, I think it's a good thing. There are costs, and it has to be, I mean, I'm being quick here because regarding, so I'm deeply convinced that the flux of capital has played a key role. And you know, on the graph, there was the line, but there were also the boxes, and you see that there is a huge amount of capital rushing in over the last years, which is something that we explicitly didn't see, or very little, back in the 90s. I'm definitely not saying that it was the only factor. And I mean, as always, there are hundreds of factors. I'm pointing out one, but there are many of them. So I would like to be cautious on this. But we can discuss this afterwards. We'll have opportunities.
Let me speak a little bit about the regulation issue, but from a different perspective. This may not apply to many of the EU countries, but in dealing with developing countries, their regulatory situation is far from being ideal. They lack the skill to implement reasonable regulatory standards. And that what happens is that because of the loose regulations, there are many inappropriate or less than desirable market players, which only worsen the market reputation of insurance. So you'll be surprised how insurers are badly reputed in some of those developing countries. So we encourage that those countries implement a higher standard, so that with the help of leading insurers from leading economies, to help implement a reasonably solid market.
As I think all the questions have been addressed already, I would like to take the chance to really thank you, Dennis Kessler, and your terrific team for having organized this great conference, which I attend many climate-related conferences, which has been the most comprehensive I've ever attended, and with real big depth into the topics and on a real high level. Congratulations to you, and I think we should give them a hand.
And maybe we can thank this great panel. I think it generated a lot of thought, and thank you again for being patient to sit this far. Thank you. Thank you.